Well, for a closer look at that gap between public and private schools, Jennifer Steele joins us live via Skype. She's an associate professor at American University's School of Education. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's interesting because for years we'd seen a decline in enrollment with private schools until the pandemic. Why was that previous trend happening, and how has the pandemic now changed that?
Well, I think that private schools make up about a quarter of schools, pre-K through 12 schools in the U.S. And I think what has happened is during the pandemic, some private schools have had more flexibility to open sooner and provide more in-person services. And for a lot of families, there is an economic benefit to that because not all families have been able to work from home. And so for families who are essential workers or who have to work outside of the home, being able to send their kids to school in person provides a really important childcare benefit. And I think that's what's been driving the migration toward private schools.
So what does this very different experience that a lot of public and private school students are having, what does that tell us about Americans and the cultural value that's put on education?
Well, I think that public and private schools, the educators in these institutions deeply value education, and the families that haven't been able to send their kids to private schools have deeply value education. But it is a question during the pandemic. There are huge questions of teacher safety and also of families' ability to, or families' comfort with sending their children to school in person. So there's a lot of variability in families' views on and comfort with that. And teachers rightly have concerns about their own safety in returning to the classroom. So I do think that has teachers in public schools typically have, in most states, they have some type of union protection. And that is less often the case in private schools. So teachers have more political voice in ensuring those kinds of basic safety precautions are in place in public schools. And I think that's been a factor in public schools being a bit slower to reopen and move toward hybrid models.
And as you mentioned, private schools did have more flexibility in when they would reopen and sort of how they would stagger that reopening. So what have private schools been able to do better over these past 12 months compared to public institutions? And what sort of lessons could perhaps be learned as more children are returning to classrooms?
Well, I think that flexibility, private schools have typically been able to offer smaller class sizes. And they do that in a number of ways. I mean, they have flexibility in how much they charge families and in order to compensate teachers. And they typically don't pay teachers quite as well as the public schools. So that's how they've been able to historically offer smaller classes. And so with smaller classes already, there's greater flexibility and ability to respond to the pandemic. And so what public schools are having to do now is think about how do they utilize their space in a way that allows for social distancing? How do they get teachers vaccinated? And they have been ensuring in many states and jurisdictions priority for teachers in getting vaccinated. And so I think public schools are having to learn a lot of that flexibility and think about how do we get classes or groups of students smaller, even if it means alternating which kids are in school on which days. So I do think public schools are already adapting some of those practices from private schools.
And we really are seeing a very divergent experience for both students and teachers in public and private education. And even some of the tuition certainly rivals some of these Ivy League colleges that you would expect. So what do you think this is doing to an already growing educational and economic divide, depending on the sort of experience that a family is having in being able to afford private school?
Well, education in the United States is incredibly unequal and has always been incredibly unequal. And I think that whenever you take schools out of the public sphere and put more responsibility on individual families and homes, you exacerbate an already unequal situation. And so I do think that we are seeing that in terms of schools' ability to reopen, be it public or private, and in terms of upper middle class families' ability to move their kids from public to private, but also in terms of the experiences, heterogeneity in experiences kids are having in public schools, with some kids being well resourced with high quality digital tools and facility with those tools, and teachers having preparation to help kids use those tools, and that being a greater challenge in other schools, just in terms of access to Wi-Fi and in terms of stable internet connections and in terms of parents being able to be home with their kids to make sure that they're engaged with the technology. So certainly we are seeing increases in inequity, and those are reflected, I think, in the test scores that you talked about in the lead-in packet that we've seen from the Stanford study. So we're going to see this rising inequity in student achievement over the coming year or two. But I also think that there's room for optimism, because I think that schools, as they respond in creative ways, are going to be able to, as students start to come back in person,
Right.
there's going to be a lot of creativity in place.
We certainly hope so. Thank you so much for your insights. Jennifer Steele there, Associate Professor at the American University School of Education.